Hello, welcome to the inaugural AJAR Academic Job Application Review seminar series that is organized by the AEESP Student Services Committee. And this is the first ever seminar series on AJAR. So this year, what we want to do is we want to showcase our outstanding graduate students and postdoctoral researchers while we celebrate the diversity in our community. So we're going to do this with this 4-month seminar series where we're going to have 16 candidates that will give in their presentations that we're going to select from over 100 applicants that we have received. We will meet every other Friday and 2 students or postdoc will present their research then. These candidates, they will also have mock interviews with members of the committee and also with senior faculty. So we are still selecting, reviewing applications and selecting our candidates, so stay tuned. We will announce our presenters as we select them and as we get closer to the date. So if you have questions, stay until the end. We will have 15 minutes after the presentations to network and discuss all the questions that you might have about this program or anything else. So let's start with our presentations. Our first speaker today is Theresa Oehmke. Teri is currently a PhD student at UC Berkeley, working with Professor Mariano in the area of fluid dynamics, especially in turbulence, particle flow interactions, and experimental work. She received her bachelor's in environmental engineering science from MIT, but she also has international experience. She worked in a lab in France and also in Senegal. She has received several awards and fellowships, and she has been a very active member of this community. So I'm very excited about her presentation, and Teri, whenever you're ready, you can start. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Lucia, for that introduction. As Lucia mentioned, my name is Teri, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, working with Professor Evan Veriano in environmental fluid mechanics. Today, I'm going to be presenting some of my dissertation work, some of these experiments I did at Berkeley, and some of them I did in France with collaborators there. So the flow of the seminar will start with me looking at and presenting background and motivation for the experimental projects that I will be presenting so that we can all start on the same page. Then I will look at the impact that turbulence has on particle movement and the impact that turbulence has on particle dissolution, because I'm really interested in particle turbulence interactions. And then at the end, I'll present a couple of future questions that I am hoping to answer throughout my career. So particle transport in the ocean is an open question. And one of the reasons that we're interested in this is to look at plastic pollutants, which I'm sure a lot of people here have heard about, and kind of where they end up in the ocean. And another motivating question that I have is what happens when we have these oceanic organisms that excrete some type of waste, and perhaps these organisms aren't supermodal, so how does that waste kind of move away from them, and how does the organism shape and size influence how it interacts with its turbulence environment? So I'm going to try to couple these two motivations together by looking at how shape and size influence both plastic movement in the ocean and as well as organism movement in the oceans. So to start out, since I am talking in turbulence, I want to make sure that kind of we understand the language that I'm going to be using later on. So turbulence can come from fluid instabilities, which kind of become unstable and then end up being turbulent. So here I have this instability that you can see in the lab on the upper left and in clouds on the upper right, and it kind of devolves and becomes turbulent, which we see on the bottom right here. And so these turbulence flows have a couple of characteristics that are universal, and they are all chaotic flows with statistical properties that you can find in many of the different turbulent flows. But the mechanics, sorry, always get that word. The mechanics behind the universal statistical properties are an open question. And so kind of exploring those mechanics, both in the fluid and how those mechanics impact particles is one of the things that I've been working on throughout my time at Berkeley. To understand, to go a little bit more into kind of these different turbulent properties, especially for the experiments that I'll be doing, we're going to look at a couple of different turbulent length scales. So if you have something that is really big, so let's take the ocean again, say you have this whale, it has so much inertia that a lot of these chaotic turbulent processes are going to be seen as random noise when kind of the whale is, say, swimming through the ocean. If we take a smaller organism like a phytoplankton, this organism is so small that any turbulent fluctuations will just, the organism will just kind of follow the flow and become a passive scalar. And so in both of these, when you're trying to figure out like how does a whale feel it, you just, model this as random noise. And when you try to figure out how does the movement of something really small, how is turbulence influencing that? The really small organism will just follow the flow. And then there's also this kind of length scale in between. So what happens when it's bigger than, it's too big to follow the flow, but it's not quite big enough where everything is felt as noise. And this is the length scale that TINA4 that I showed before lies within. And in this length scale, it's really computationally expensive to model numerically. And so what I'm going to do is take organisms that are this length scale and model them as particles. And so for both the motion of particles that I'm interested in, that I'm going to be talking about, they'll be on kind of this length scale of 1 to 2 centimeters. And then when I'm looking at the solute transport, I'm also looking at solute transport away from something that is 1 to 2 centimeters in length. So having this kind of turbulent, chaotic flow pattern and this scale that is difficult to model numerically makes these projects that I'll be presenting really interesting and difficult. So I'm going to start with talking about particle rotation and trying to figure out how does the size of a particle influence how it rotates when it's within a turbulent flow. This research is some of the stuff that I did in France with Gauthier-Virgil in Marseille. And what we did here was we looked at 5 different particles. We had 3 different triangle particles, which we can see in this insert here on the right side of the screen. And then we also looked at squares and hexagons that are of the middle size range that we tested. And so in the chart on the left, we have the different shapes that I tested in the different sizes. And this R equals 2.5 millimeters, for example, that is the radius of the circle within which these shapes were circumscribed. So we have these 3 different sizes of triangles and 3 different shapes, and all of the aspect ratios for each of the shapes stays the same. And we also tested these shapes at 3 different frequencies to see how does the turbulent forcing also change the behavior of the particles when they're in this flow. The tank that I used for this is about 60 centimeters cubed, and it has 8 motors and impellers, 1 on each corner of the tank. And these motors and impellers rotate in alternating directions so that we can get that homogeneous isotropic turbulence in the middle of it, because right now we're really trying to understand kind of some more of the fundamentals, and we're not really looking, so we're taking away kind of some of the wall effects or other flow effects from not having isotropic or homogeneous turbulence. To capture the data, we used 3 cameras, and these cameras are located orthogonally to each other so that we can get 3 different points of view, so that we can then reconstruct and kind of project these particles' trajectories in 3D space. After we collected the data, we were then able to have, as I mentioned, the 3 different views of all of these particles when they're in the tank. And so when we have these 3 different views, we can then binarize the images and select just the one particle that we're interested in. We then take the particle's location on these images and project it into 3D space to create its 3D trajectory as it's moving through the flow. And we created these trajectories by using a nearest neighbor method. So we just said in time step 1, the particle is at this location, and time step 2, which particle in our time step 2 images are closest to the location in time step 1, and let's link that to our trajectory. So once we have these long particle trajectories, which are several seconds in length, we can then decompose the particle's movement into tumbling and spinning. And so spinning, if we take the flat plane of the particle, the normal vector to that plane, the rotation around the normal vector is the spinning, and the rotation around the other 2 axes is the tumbling of the particle. So when we're looking at tumbling and spinning, we can then take that and plot it based on particle size to try to figure out kind of what is the scaling law that we're looking for and what can that tell us about the physics of the flow. And so here on this plot, we have the tumbling and the spinning of the particles on the vertical axis, and that's normalized by the Kolmogorov time scale, which is a time scale of the fluid flow. And then on the horizontal axis, we have this radius of the particle, again, normalized by the Kolmogorov length scale. And here we can see that both tumbling and spinning follow this -4/3 power law, which tells us that the motion of the particle is governed by eddies within the flow that are on the same length size as the particles that we're introducing into these flows. So to give a couple of perspectives on this portion, we know that size matters more than shape, and that we can see that these flat particles that we have tend to tumble more than they spin. So they don't rotate around their kind of z-axis as much. And the -4/3 power law scaling means that eddies of the same size of the particles are really kind of what the forcing is for these particle rotation, which means that size is really important. And these findings agree with results from Pujara et al., I think in 2018, that shows that 3D kind of more solid particles and not flat particles also follow the same type of scaling law. And so this scaling and knowing that size governs particle motion is really important for how we decided kind of our the next project that I'm going to talk about. So this project looks at dissolution and the impact of turbulence on particle dissolution. And what I'm looking at here is how can how does this solute move away from a particle as it's dissolving? So the question that we looked at here was, what are the governing parameters for the mass transfer rate from the particle surface? So we said motion obviously has to be important. So let's start with 2 different particles that are the same size, but different shapes. Since before we saw that size was the governing factor, we have this rod particle and this disk particle. And I'm going to be talking about those for this next project. So for this dissolving particles, we wanted something that would be neutrally buoyant and keep its shape, and also kind of release solute as it's interacting with the flow. So we decided to use sugar and hollow glass microspheres to create this neutrally buoyant particle. And our sugar, we used a mixture of dextrose and sucrose, which are 2 different types of sugar. And we varied the temperatures to kind of find the ideal particle recipe, which is here in this middle of the graph. And these other ones that are shown are kind of the different experiments that we showed in showing how those either weep or kind of don't really melt, and that doesn't really work out. So once we had this ideal particle, we were able to this ideal recipe, we were able to move to the next step. To create the ideal recipe, though, actually took quite an iterative process. And so what we did was, after we mixed everything together, we then weighed this kind of slurry that we had. And the weight was really important because in order to get to this picture of this particle that is neutrally buoyant and self-similar as it dissolves. And we had to go through kind of these steps pretty carefully. After weighing the particles, we then heated them up. So if you've ever made caramel on the stove, it's a really similar process. You have to heat it up, but if you heat it up too much, your caramel will be too hard. If you heat it up too little, you'll end up having caramel sauce instead of caramel candy. And so kind of this heating and weighing iterative process is something that we did in addition to using a thermometer to make sure that we had the correct water content at the end, because we found out that water was really the important part for having these good particles. So after we got to this ideal water content, we could then pour the particles into these molds. So over here on the left, we have an ideal of this rod mold for the rod particles that we have. And then we also have these disc particles. So on the right, we can see the final rod and disc particles. And the size of these, the rods are about 1 inch in length with a 1/4 inch on the other 2 dimensions, and the discs are 1/2 inch and about 1 inch, 1/2 inch square and about a 1/4 inch thick. And so these two shapes have the same volume. And so we were looking at, okay, if we use volume and size kind of analogously, then how does their dissolution happen when we know that they should or have the same kind of overall motion. These particles were also tested in a homogeneous isotropic turbulence tank. This one is a little bit different. It's an 800-gallon tank, so quite large. Each of these particles only weighed about 1 gram, so quite a large tank for a small particle. And the turbulence here was forced by these 2 synthetic jet arrays, which we can see at either end of the tank. So to measure these particles, we dropped them into the middle of the tank, let them interact with the flow a little bit, and then fished them out and weighed them at different discrete time steps. So here in the bottom right of the screen, we can see a time series of what this particle would look like at the beginning, kind of at the 0 seconds and 1 second. We see that the particle is moving quite quickly. A lot of this has to do with the momentum from the particle being dropped into the tank. And then it kind of stays in one spot for quite a few seconds, which is pretty characteristic of the behavior that we saw throughout the whole measurement process. We determine that the particle dissolution rate follows this model that is presented at the top of the screen. So it says that the change in volume is proportional to the original volume minus this particle dissolution recession rate. And so we said, okay, well, now we're looking at this recession rate, and we're assuming that the mass of the particle is lost perpendicularly to each surface. So it's lost normal to the plane of the surface, which is why we can kind of use this form, because we made that assumption. And so with this model, we can see here that the rods actually dissolve faster than the discs. And so here on this plot, we have the normalized mass, the M over M naught, on the vertical axis, and this deals with any type of idiosyncrasies or small manufacturing small manufacturing differences for each different particle. And on the horizontal axis, we have the time in minutes. And so we see that since the rods kind of have this steeper slope down, they have a faster dissolution rate, which our model also predicts quite nicely. And so what does this tell us when we put everything together? So from the first set of experiments, we could see that we had a size that really governed motion. When we tested size for dissolving particles, we saw that that even though the particles have the same volume, they don't dissolve in the same way. So there has to be another parameter other than volume that governs this dissolution rate. And one of the parameters that we're looking into is surface area, because if everything is dissolving normal to the surface, then surface area has to be really important. But what we see is that there's some kind of play between volume and surface area. And so that's something that I'm still exploring. So To wrap up, just a few questions that I'm interested in pursuing, because I also want to give enough time for audience questions before we move on to the next speaker. So overall, these two projects had to deal with particles in flow and kind of different types of multi-phase flow. So those are some of the two things that I'm really interested in pursuing in my next step, and as I look for a postdoc position. One of the questions that I have is kind of, okay, so what happens if you put more than one of these kind of dissolving particles in at a time? So right now I'm looking at the background of the flow tank as a perfect sink because it's 800 gallons and the particle is only 1 gram. But what happens if there's like sugar in the tank? What happens if you change the concentration? What happens if you group a whole bunch of these particles together? Then there's a local concentration that may be higher than the overall concentration. And another question that I'm looking at is how, for either the plastic particles or the dissolving particles, how does like the number, how do particle-particle interactions affect kind of these results that I found? Because so far these are pretty dilute particle concentrations that I'm looking at. And then another one is preferential orientation and clustering. So we know that there is some preferential orientation that happens for different size particles, different shape particles in turbulence, but I want to characterize that for the experiments that I've already done and kind of see what does that look like for these flat particles, how would that translate into dissolving particles, and how would that influence some of the other questions that I've posed. So in the end, I could not have done this without my two advisors, so Professor Evan Veriano at Berkeley and Dr. Gauthier Verhil at IRFE in France, and then my team of undergraduates. Jennifer, Derek, Tracy, and Bond have all worked with me for, I think, at least a summer, if not longer, and they were really instrumental in getting all of this work done in the lab. And then I want to thank my group members at Environmental Fluid Mechanics and Hydrology at Berkeley, NSF for helping to fund some of this research, and also the Chateaubriand Fellowship that helped fund my research in France. So thank you, and I hope we have time for a few questions.
Yes, we do. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Teri. If any of the audience members have questions, please raise your hand in the chat, or raise your hand and I will call on you. So please.
I can also just start seeing more videos. I have tons of videos, just go back and play through some of these.
Or you can unmute yourself and talk. I have. Sanjay, please.
Very nice presentation. I liked it. Can you share your thought process of deciding the particle shapes? You showed 3 different shapes here. Mm-hmm. What was the thought process behind that?
Great, thank you. So for the first project, I think maybe you're talking about the 3 different shapes, the hexagons, triangles, and squares. And so what we were looking at is what happens as you go more towards a disk. Because a lot of things numerically are modeled as disks and spheres because it's easier with the symmetry. Also in nature, you find a lot of kind of these smaller organisms that are either long rods in shapes or kind of spheroidals in shape. And so we said, okay, well, yes, we have a lot of these kind of disc shaped things. They're an easy simplification to make, but what happens is you go farther away from that. And so that's kind of how we came up with these different polygons. And then that's also how we came up with the kind of simplified disc and rod shapes that I used for the dissolving particles as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Lisa. Can you?
Hi, interesting work, Terry. Thanks for sharing it. I think I might have missed this in the beginning, but are there particular particles in the ocean you're interested in looking at, like in terms of pollution or plastics? Just motivation for this work.
Yeah, so for some of the plastic things, especially the flat ones, it's just kind of, you have these big pieces of plastic that kind of that go into the ocean, but when we find them, they're much smaller. And also there's a lot of plastic that has been predicted as being in the ocean, but we don't know where it is. And so one of the motivations for me is to say, okay, if we can figure out how these kind of intermediate sized particles move and how they respond to turbulent forcing, will that help us better predict where they're going to end up in the ocean, because we can't find a lot of them. And then one of the other motivations, so I guess there are kind of two motivations, but there's an overarching theme of like kind of these particles and turbulence. But we had some collaborators who were looking at biomechanics. And so they had this organism that isn't supermodal, but still does not end up suffocating itself with like excrement or things like that, and it still end up able to find kind of nutrients in the ocean. And so figuring out like, okay, this organism has, you know, this kind of shape, it's not supermodal, so like how does solute move away from it? How does nutrients, like how does it find its nutrients? And so those are kind of two of the motivations for these things.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, I think I have one question and then we'll move on. Have you thought of heterogeneous particles, those that have different composition and different dissolution rates, so the dissolution will not be same rate, and that might affect the, I'm thinking of mineral phases that are all in one single particle and they're moving. Have you thought of that? Or?
Yes. So I guess I've thought of that in terms of trying to make sure that my particles don't have it. Because one of the things that I'm worried about is what happens if the particle is heterogeneous and a chunk of it like falls out in the middle of testing. Mm-hmm. How do I note that in my experiments? Can I use that experiment at all? Because if, say, it's heavier, then it's going to change the entire dynamics throughout the time series. If it's lighter, it's going to change the entire dynamics throughout the time series. So I haven't thought of that in terms of kind of testing that specifically for a particle that I've created, but I've thought of that as in a way of trying to kind of eliminate it. So I think with that experience, it would probably be reasonable to kind of try to introduce some of those heterogeneities purposely and look at that in particles as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And if I think that we are done with questions, it's 12:30, so we're going to move to the next speaker, and Nirupam is going to introduce him. Thank you so much, Teri. Excellent presentation.
Let me jump in for a second here. So what I suggest is, since we are getting to know each other here, and one of the purposes is getting to know each other, when people ask a question, please tell us your name, where you're from. We get to know you a little bit, and you get a reward for asking a question. So let's do that for the next one, right? All right, go ahead, Nirupa.
Yeah, thank you, Manish. Thanks, Lucia and Terry. This is a great start. And I see that Mohamed is here. So I'm introducing Mohamed Attia from Northwestern University. He is currently a research associate within the Department of Chemistry, but like he will present his research on physicochemical treatment processes of different contaminants. But the most interesting thing I noticed, and everyone will notice, that his unique experiences in different places in the world, like he comes from Middle East and from Egypt specifically, and he did his bachelor's there. Then he moved to Japan, and I think he has visiting research scholar experiences in Europe too. And so he brings a very unique approach, like experience to show us the diversity of his research, not only his research, but also his experiences collaborating and working in different parts of the world. It's a very unique experience, kind of similar to Teri too. She has had some experience there too in working in different places. So he has, like Mohammed has a huge publication list. I'm not going to talk about that, but just so you know, he has like 41 publications, peer-reviewed articles so far on different topics, and he's going to summarize and talk about his most interesting works here. And I'm just very happy to introduce him here and giving the talk. So I'm just going to mention that I'll be leaving before it ends. So Monish is going to take over the question answer session and ending of the seminar series today. Okay, thank you. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you so very much for the kind of introduction. It's a great honor actually for me to present my work to all of you today. My name is Mohamed Ateia. I go by Moha. I'm an environmental engineer by training, but currently I'm working as a research associate at the Department of Chemistry at Northwestern University. And my research interest is to develop new water treatment technologies by leveraging my knowledge of both water chemistry and materials chemistry. So I will take this opportunity today to share some highlights on some fundamental and practical work that I have done over the past few years. And my goal is to give you an idea about the generality of the challenges that we are facing, as well as the opportunities that we can take as engineers and scientists. Okay, so very, very broad introduction, like water treatment history. 1500 BC, humans invented like several water treatment technologies that showed to be very effective over time. For instance, Egyptians, I come from Egypt. Ancient Egyptians actually used alum to clarify their water, which is being used now until today around the world as a flocculant. But like 3,000 years later, the first city-scale water treatment plant was constructed in Scotland. It was a simple sand filter, but that was kind of okay because people used to believe that water is mainly polluted by stuff like natural organic matter, which is coming from animal and plant decay. But microorganisms were always there, but no one could see them until microscopes were invented. In fact, it's like mind-blowing that chemical disinfection and the wide use of hypochlorite and ozone started only around 100 years ago. So today, on the other hand, our water sources contain like a cocktail of organic matters, as well as like synthetic chemicals. And that required much sophisticated treatment plants. So emerging contaminants of emerging concerns, you can name different stuff, micropollutants we call them, including like pesticides, pharmaceuticals, perfluoroalkyl substances, disinfection byproducts, and many others. And these like structurally diverse chemicals are problematic because of their increasing concentrations in our water sources, and they are persistent and toxic. So one of the major sources, I give here an example from Switzerland. They have huge investment in that topic, which clarify that one of the major sources coming like from wastewater treatment plant. And as you can see in this figure, like having micropollutants showing up in the effluent just indicates that our current conventional techniques are failing against these emerging contaminants. Meanwhile, like the magnitude of the problem is huge. Like given that we have 100,000 chemicals are registered in Europe, 80,000 in the US, more than the half of these are already in the market. So everyone would agree that there is no silver bullet here, which means like both innovative and traditional solutions need to combine and merge to tackle such problem. Okay, so today I will walk you through my research activities that I did over the past few years at Tokyo Tech, University of Copenhagen, then Clemson, and currently at Northwestern University. My research goal is to develop and evaluate next generation physical-chemical water treatment solutions. My major efforts were on absorption, photocatalysis, linking them to develop self-cleaning absorbents. I worked on membranes, electroactive membranes, and my target here is to have like high flux self-cleaning membranes with anti-fouling properties. I tested these technologies on a wide range of emerging contaminants, including PFAS, pesticides, disinfection. I did also work on that and work on disinfection byproducts. And recently, I'm also actively working on the topic of microplastics. So to stress this out again, the core of my research expertise is physicochemical water treatment processes. And in my work, the common theme, I would say that to study emerging contaminants at environmentally relevant conditions. Okay, so let's start with the absorption topic here. So my passion in this specific area is to contribute in finding next generation adsorbent. That's why I was determined to understand and get hands-on experience about each step in the cycle shown here, from having a target contaminants to the development or selection of adsorbents, testing them in the lab, pilot scale, all the way to full-scale applications. So when I started my PhD at Tokyo Tech, I had two major targets at that point. First is to understand how things work in adsorption-based systems. And second is to learn how to test materials. So I studied carbon nanotube, made them magnetic, tested them for pesticide removal. Then I decided to dive deeper on the competitive adsorption part, and I explained the interactions between natural organic matter, different fraction of these, and carbon nanotube. And the last piece was on using ozone to regenerate and recycle carbon nanotube. So today I will focus more on this competitive adsorption part. During my PhD, I was actually very interested in this NOM, as I highlighted earlier. They come from decaying animal and plants in our water sources, and they're abundant, they're everywhere, with high concentration than micropollutants. So I wanted to learn more about their characteristics. Was very fortunate that I had two bachelor students that I was mentoring at that time who had also interest in learning my work. One of them, Shimizu here, actually published his bachelor thesis by applying the method framework that I developed. So why is this important at all? So basically, both the size and the charge of adsorbents and adsorbates would affect our adsorption system. So as you can see here, one of the major limitations of micropollutants removal by activated carbon comes from NOM, natural organic matter. This can be either by blocking the micropore region of the carbon or the displacement of micropollutants on the surface of carbon. But what about carbon nanotubes, which they have different pore structures and characteristics? So when I planned this project, initially, I was trying to investigate this competitive adsorption part between pesticides and NOM. But when I started experiments with only NOM, I observed something that took my attention, and I decided to dig deeper on that. So what you see here is a size exclusion chromatograms that you have an HPLC with a column that can fractionate NOM to different sizes for different humic acids before and after adsorption. So what is important here that I noticed that this small fraction around 300 Daltons, it didn't get removed. I repeated the experiments with fulvic acid and RO isolates, and the same results kept repeating. So I decided to run systematic tests to understand what's actually happening here. I used like 11 different NOM types, 4 carbon nanotubes, ran kinetics and isotherm experiments. And for each sample before and after adsorption, I tested for total organic carbon, UV absorption, used fluorescence spectroscopy, and size exclusion chromatograph. So what you see here is the major finding from this study. So basically, NOM fractions are more, like some fraction of these are more preferable to adsorbent carbon nanotubes. This is highlighted in green here. And others highlighted in red are less preferable to be removed. So the insights from the fluorescence spectroscopy on the left-hand side showed that the preferable fraction is coming from more terrestrially derived NOM, while the less preferable fraction is more microbially derived NOM and more fresh. So then we decided to check the adsorption behavior of NOM on activated carbon and how it would compare with carbon nanotube. What you see here is a comparison between activated carbon and carbon nanotube using 2 different isolates and 2 different river water samples. And it was very interesting to see that actually we have different or opposite behavior between the two materials, where the small fractions that was not removed by carbon nanotube, it was the first and faster to be removed by activated carbon. So one possible reason here that this fraction get actually trapped in the micropore region of activated carbon, while carbon nanotube, all of or most of its active absorption sites are on the surface and would preferably absorb the more aromatic and hydrophobic fraction, which we observed already in the previous study. So two take-home messages that you can take from here. First, that this study showed that NOM fractions, they do have preferential absorption behaviors. And the second thing is that the reported method that I developed here and I reported are very systematic and reproducible, which can be generalized to study other adsorbents as well. So after finishing my PhD, I moved to Clemson as a postdoc. And my new target here was to learn how to improve material properties. So in Clemson, I initiated many projects and collaborations, but the major one was on finding efficient like removal solutions for PFAS in collaboration with the chemistry and bioengineering departments. So what is PFAS? PFAS is the perfluoroalkyl substances. It's a large family of chemicals that are being used in many consumer products. That's why they would have many pathways to get into our water sources and eventually to our bodies. So when I was in Japan, PFAS was not a major issue for them, but since I moved to the US, I saw how much focus it got over the past few years. So simply, I decided to ride the wave and try to contribute in finding a solution for that. So, okay, let's have a look on our target here. A PFAS compound here is a PFOA, one of them as a model compound, would have a hydrophobic tail and an ionized head. This would make them very highly water soluble and also suggest different removal mechanisms depending on the adsorbents that we are using. So on activated carbon, hydrophobic interactions are more dominant, while electrostatic interactions are more dominant in the ion exchange resin case. But things are more complex because PFAS tend sometimes to form micelles, which makes also the pore size and structure influential on the adsorption process. So when I started this work, I noticed three major limitations in the literature. First, that testing of materials and treatability work in general were at very high concentrations, like up to hundreds of milligrams per liter, which is 3 or 4 times orders of magnitude higher, more than the PFAS that you would find in water or wastewater samples. Second, that the efficiency of these materials would show drop in the efficiency in real water samples. And the third is observation was like, the focus was mainly on long chain PFAS. And why this is problematic, the figure here shows like different PFAS, like the carbon length, it's represented here by C number. So C4 is short chain, C12 is long chain PFAS, and X-axis shows like the longer the chain length, you get more hydrophobic property of the compound. And then Y-axis shows like the breakthrough bit volume in a carbon adsorption case. So obviously, if you are testing your material and judging its performance on a long chain PFAS compound, you would be like overlooking a lot of short chain PFAS that we would go and escape into your treated water. And that's why it's problematic. And then I thought, okay, what can be an alternative adsorption system then? So in my first work, I put a challenging task for myself that I said, like, I want something that can be cheap and easy to prepare, and also should show fast and selective removal. Very optimistic. So from my readings, I could see the sense that what functional groups that could work well, and which is amine groups, basically. And after some trials with cellulose, silica, and other adsorbents, I found cellulose could be a good candidate, which we successfully prepared here. And this new polymer showed very promising results, like selective and fast removal of a wide range of PFAS at low initial concentration. Like that was one of the very few first studies that tested like 1 microgram per liter as initial concentration, and low adsorbent dose, which is related to how much can this be scalable. But we always have an however there. So the however here is that the adsorption was dependent on the chain length, which suggests hydrophobic interaction dominant mechanism here. So what you can see in the figure here, oh, where is my mouse? Okay, so the solid bar in the lower figure is the experiments in pure water, the midi-pure water, while the dash is under the same condition, but in a lake water. From selectivity point of view, it works well, but with the shorter chain lengths, it doesn't work as well. So the next target for me was, okay, what to do with these short chain PFAS? So I thought, like, if we maximize the electrostatic interactions, this might help in that regard. So I collaborated with the chemistry department and developed a new cationic polymer that showed very promising results, good removal and selective removal and very rapid removal of different classes of PFAS in lake water, river water, treated wastewater, effluent in a very short time. And it was very easy to prepare as well. So here, however, I like to challenge myself, like hydrogel is very good, but how can it be practical? This needs much more work on the optimization angle. I didn't resume working on that since I moved to my new position, but I have ideas on how to further improve. And I actually have people contact me from companies interested in that work that we can continue collaboration on it in the future. So after this work was came out, I got invited by ESNT letter to publish a critical review about PFAS removal by aminated adsorbents. And I have also a focused review on ultra short and short chain PFAS. So in parallel to all of that, I was also working on the removal of bromide and iodide to reduce disinfection by product formation. I developed a new composite based on silver chloride. I also worked on bromide selective ion exchange resins and application of pre-chlorination on reduction of DBP's formation. So today, I'll focus mainly on the first work, the composite that I prepared for removal of bromide and iodide selectively from water. And the motivation here is to remove these two anions to reduce the toxic brominated and iodinated disinfection byproducts. So as you can see in the figure here, that these are much more toxic than the chlorinated analogs, orders of magnitude higher. But the biggest challenge for bromide and iodide removal comes from chloride. So chloride is more abundant and always compete with any system that you use to remove them. So for me, I had a simple hypothesis. It's ion exchange based. I said, like, if we can use the silver chloride form, so this would help us to overcome the chloride competition. But that was not very straightforward, as I said, because silver chloride itself is very sensitive to light and other conditions that would need careful way of preparation. So I spent months of trials with granule activated carbon, powder activated carbon, all of them failed. But then I tried to change the carbon morphology further and use superfine activated carbon. So in a nutshell, it worked very well, even in real sample, groundwater sample, and treated wastewater effluents. One major reason why this works well compared to the other systems, that the hydrophilic nature of SPAC, superfine activated carbon, facilitate the protection of silver chloride, which I said is sensitive to light, from oxidation by light and other conditions. So this composite was prepared as slurry. So typically, this is a way to apply superfine activated carbon. But the advantage that we got extra here, that when you have silver chloride on your material, it becomes easier to settle, which will facilitate later how it can be removed by simple settling. So I envision, like, if you put it at the intake, once you reach settling tank, you can get rid of it easily without adding extra step for separation of these from your water. So your take-home message from this, that the composite worked very well, very rapid and selective removal of bromide and iodide at low dose, which means it's also scalable. So in a link between DBPs and microplastics, I also found recently that microplastics leach precursors of DBPs by hydrolysis and photodegradation. These precursors were found to be as reactive as NOM in our water. You can see this paper for more details on that topic. So the more I work with materials, my curiosity was increasing, and I wanted to learn more about how to create new materials. So given my experience with PFAS, I was confident that the Dictyl group at Northwestern is the best place to be for me, best fit. So their work and their adsorbents currently being commercialized in the market. So I moved here last November. Oh, that's the previous November. Where is 2020? And part of my work is also to support the Cyclopure company, but from Northwestern. So another adsorption-related project is removal of uranium using porous crystalline organic polymer, and it's composite with mixane. I won't go in details of that one because I want to share with you another unique aspect of my journey here, which is related to Cyclopure. So here at Northwestern, as I mentioned, part of my work is to support the R&D department of Cyclopure. They're developing new adsorbents for trace organic contaminants removal, and my role is to help them for finding destruction method for PFAS. The company is very actively engaging in many projects around the US for water and wastewater treatment plants. So to conclude this adsorption section, I thought like this should be the best example to share with you that with the right vision and leadership, that new adsorbents, these novel adsorbents that you can see in studies, if you spend more efforts on them, promising example from them can be scaled up and applied in consumer products in water treatment plants as well. So I have summarized my thoughts, given that I have this interdisciplinary experience of both chemistry and engineering. I could find some flaws in some studies that I summarized in here in this best practices for evaluating new materials as adsorbents. And this would be helpful in the future once we have a nice data set. We can feed modeling and get like reduce our experimental efforts to get results as well. So now I'll give very brief examples of my work on photocatalysis. Like I do believe in efficient separation of pollutants, but I also believe that I need to make sure that I destroy them to avoid producing any side waste. So I mentored 3 students in Japan using photocatalysis for micropollutant degradation, for disinfection. I also collaborated with Ezra Cates in Clemson on PFAS degradation using photocatalysis. I invite you to check this work, that very cool work with my mentees on fundamental and practical aspects of photocatalysis. But today I feel more excited to give you another sign of hope that photocatalysis also can move to large scale, which matter the most at the end of the day. So in 2018, we published this paper on the synthesis of bismuth oxyhydroxyphosphate, which showed very rapid and efficient degradation of PFOA. So BHP, before that, it was only found in nature, and that was the first time to prepare it in the lab. So in a nutshell, the catalysts destroy PFAS by both oxidation and reduction after attraction of PFAS to its surface by electrostatic interaction. But since then, we were busy thinking about how to get the most out of this finding. So the goal was to scale the system up in a pilot scale system in collaboration with Purifix, which we did successfully, as shown here, the destruction of a wide range of PFAS in pilot scale. And our recent ESNT engineering paper showed the effect of system design on the degradation performance. So bottom line, which is the good news, as I said, I wanted to share that photocatalysis also can be scaled up and can be energy efficient when we combine fundamental understanding of a system with a proper engineering design. So to conclude, I believe that the current and future challenges in water quality and with emerging contaminants will require solutions beyond conventional techniques. And here, my skills in micropollutants removal and destruction, as well as my design capabilities of new materials, can greatly contribute in solving these emerging challenges. So in addition to assessment of conventional technologies, exploration of new directions like porous organic polymers, nanobubbles with membranes, electroactive membranes, just to name a few, are potential ways to go. In the long term, I plan to use our experimental data to inform machine learning and work with my collaborator closely to develop new algorithms that can be tailored for materials discovery for water treatment applications specifically, like new adsorbents and membrane. So I'm forever thankful for all the supportive mentors that I have and mentees and collaborators. I'm confident that they are and will remain great support for my next career steps. And thank you all for attending my talk today.
Great job, Moha. So we have time for questions. Please raise your hand. Oh, there are lots of hands.
Oh,
Or this is just clapping, I think.
okay.
Hands are welcome too.
Yeah,
Okay,
I just
I
need
had
to drink some water.
Yeah, I had a question for you about your AGCL functionalized powdered activated carbon, superfine.
Superfine activated, yeah.
What is the mechanism of that for bromide or iodide removal, right? That was your purpose there, right?
Yeah, so it's, as I said, it's just ion exchange. You will switch bromide, chloride with bromide or iodide. They have lower solubility and they have that potential of exchange very easy.
I see. And then why was the superfine important there?
So the superfine, it's hydrophilic. It makes it suspended in the water. It dims the light inside the solution. So when I tested with GAC and PAC, they settled pretty fast and they leave the silver chloride. And then the silver chloride get photooxidized. And then after photooxidation, you will get silver, which is not selective for bromide and iodide. So silver is conventionally used for like 20 years now. So once we maintain the silver chloride as silver chloride, that ion exchange capabilities can be possible then.
And there's
yeah.
And there's no leaching of silver or anything from this while you're doing the treatment?
I didn't see that. Like I use ICP, I didn't see silver, and I took the material, did XPS. I confirmed that after the treatment, I would get the carbon, and also it has silver iodide and silver bromide instead of silver chloride. So yeah.
Great. All right, other questions?
Please.
Yeah, this online forum, it's hard for people to engage. So that's what we are trying here to do our best to encourage each other. So.
Hi, Moha.
Hello.
Hi.
You have a PFAS question, I know.
It's me, right?
Yeah, go ahead, ask your question. Yeah.
I have a question about the machine learning. So you, in future work you mentioned, because experiment work is always very time demanding and a lot of work. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit about the framework or the plan for the machine learning part?
So the example that I give in this slide is related to material discovery, but the machine learning can go in a different steps, like from the discovery to the optimization or selection of potential new materials, and also for the evaluation, which I think I gave that QSPR or QSAR modeling as one of the ways to minimize the experimental work and go more with modeling. But what is missing now is the experimental work or experimental data that would feed the modeling and then give us more reliable outcome. So what's happening now that you have modeled input and you give it to the model and then you give them another modeled output. So that's why people are still skeptical about it. So that's why I put it as a long-term plan. So while I'm doing my work, I plan to do it in a systematic way that it keeps building up until I have enough data set that can be useful for such purpose. So yeah, it will take some years, but I guess it needs a plan from the beginning.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Nice work.
Thank you.
Great. So we're beyond 12. Everybody's welcome to stay and chat for another 10-15 minutes if you would like. And thank you all for coming. This was great beginning to our seminar series. And let's thank Mohammed one more time.
Thank you.